Talking about land, there are some NGOs who don't believe that you can have any impact without having control of the land. African Parks is, I would say, the world's largest private land management company for nature. I think around 18 million or 20 million hectare. You're managing land for the governments in Africa. It's also an NGO, but it has a very, very strong impact on the ground. Helge, please come on stage. Last year we had Arendt. I'm very happy you are here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us here and for giving us the opportunity to share our thoughts on this. So I'm going to take you from the cold Zurich to Africa. I'm Global Head of Funding for African Parks. We are the largest conservation organization on the continent, very much focused just on Africa. And I'll obviously talk about two things here. One is nature, and the second is Africa. We all know that in order to have a healthy planet, we need to set aside at least 30% of land and seas for nature. And I'm trying to tell you a little bit about how we think we can do that. So what I want to do is three things. I want to raise the urgency for us to focus on Africa. I want to talk about a roadmap that we have for achieving the 30% in Africa and the role of protected areas in that. And I want to engage you on our journey and all the things that need to happen in order for us to scale up, as well as to create the innovations that will allow us to achieve that. Why the urgency of Africa? Two things. One is Africa is probably the continent with the most remaining natural capital in place. It's 25% of the world's biodiversity. It has incredible intact landscapes across the continent. At the same time, it's probably the place on Earth where the pressure on nature is going to grow most significantly in the next years. Population growth is massive. Compared to all the other continents on this world, we're going to grow by 3 times until 2100. Climate change affects the continent more than anywhere else. 70 to 80% of land is degraded, which means people have to go cut forest and use the still intact nature in order to grow food. We also have a problem of good governance of natural resources, and at the same time, a big problem with lack of financing. So what does this lead to? It basically leads to the fact that if you don't manage well existing natural resources, you're going to lose them. And this picture of Liwonde National Park in Malawi is actually the best example for this. You see what happens when deforestation for firewood, when pastoralism and agriculture basically degrades land to an estate that it's not going to be able to be reversed anymore. On the left hand is a national park, which is managed, which is protected. So what I want to talk about is how we're going to grow that green back into that place where it's degraded. And in our experience, everything starts with the places that are still intact, the protected areas of Africa. But not all of them, and I'll get to that later, but those that are really intact, that are sizable to be able to actually have an impact in the broader landscape. The starting point is managing these areas effectively. That means engaging with local communities on natural resource management, setting up the governance mechanism, including local governments, including local communities, in order to do that. If you do that right, and you basically re-establish the ecosystem services from these protected areas, you'll get to a point that this spills over into a broader ecosystem. And you can actually work in the adjacent areas, which are often game management areas, these are community conservancies, in order to really establish the ecosystem there again. And that, again, after 5 to 9 years, this is a long-term game, you'll get to a point where you can work with local governments and communities on much broader land use planning processes that enable to shift towards a nature-positive land use, which includes agroforestry, it can include restoration activities. And all of that pathway allows to to actually impact from that starting point of that protected areas, an area that can be 5 times the size of that initial point. African Parks does that at scale. We manage 22 parks across the continent, a total of 20 million hectares, Marco, growing every year, 12 countries. We employ 4,300 people locally. So that's literally boots on the ground. And if you look at the potential of that portfolio, we can actually impact 100 million hectares in Africa for positive land use. That's around 10% of the target that we need to do. So how do we get there? Where's the roadmap? Obviously, you can't start basically operating in every single protected area in Africa. Actually, there's a bit of a challenge here because we have 8,500 protected areas in Africa, but most of them actually don't exist anymore. They have been basically transformed towards agricultural land. There are settlements in it. It's too late. We have identified 161 areas that have the potential to actually grow from that protected areas into the landscape. And I'm just going to tell you or show you a little bit why that notion of paper parks is so important. Here you have a little bit of a map of what is the western side of Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, and the southern part of Guinea. And in that picture on the left side, you have, or on the right side here, you have basically 63 parks. They are gazetted, they are officially there. But if you overlay this with deforestation data, with population data, you actually realize that only 4 are left. And out of these 4, actually only 2 have the critical size to actually allow for that entire pathway. So the pathway is fairly clear. There's a roadmap. We can, if we use these 161 protected areas and manage them effectively, basically, first of all, protect 5% of the land in Africa, we have the potential to create a foundation for that growing out into the broader landscape and actually have a major contribution towards that target of 30 by 30. We can actually reach 25% of land in Africa with that pathway. The cost is not unrealistic. It's 1 billion per year. And if you compare it to what we spend on other things, that shouldn't be a real issue. But we do also need to think, how do we finance that in perpetuity? So the last 2 minutes, I want to speak about new funding mechanisms. And we all know how powerful the carbon market has been. And we all know kind of benefits and also the flaws of that system. We need to move beyond that, at least from a nature perspective, in order to enable to monetize the full suite of ecosystem services that nature provides. But the challenge, obviously, is how are we going to do that, right? Carbon market has really the strong suit of having this one fungible piece of metric, which is the ton of CO2 equivalent. Nature is much more complex. But we need to continue to innovate and actually work around that. And together with a number of partners, African Parks actually has come up with an approach which we call a verifiable nature unit. The principles behind that is similar to carbon. We need to look at outcomes-based and retrospective monetization of an impact that has been achieved. We need to find a way, don't need to overcomplicate, we need to find a way to translate the complexity of nature into something very simple, pragmatic, and verifiable. And we need to make sure that we correct one specific flaw of the system of the carbon market, and that is we need to value, first and foremost, what is intact and need to take that forward and basically compensate all the stakeholders that currently have such high opportunity cost to actually protecting the nature, and we need to find a way to basically pay for them. So what we do at African Parks is we have 20 million hectares, and we have boots on the ground, we have a first approach, we know this is going to evolve, technology is really fast, we need catalytic funders that want to take a leap of faith and say, we don't only want to talk about this, we want to get started with you. We can provide you that platform. And so if you're interested in that, please talk to me. Thank you.